This episode is proudly brought to you by Recovery, the Central Coast's leading destination for health, wellness, and performance recovery. Whether you're an athlete pushing your limits or just in need of some serious self-care, Recovery has got you covered. From infrared saunas and compression therapy to ice baths and soft tissue treatments, they've got all the science-backed tools to help you feel and perform at your very best. Head to grecovery.com.au to book your next session or learn more. That's grecovery.com.au. Good with you? Yeah? Sweet.
Go for it.
Geoff, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
So you're a reproductive biologist and a researcher at the University of Newcastle, and you specialize in male infertility.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
What got you into that?
Very indirect. So born and bred in Newcastle, did my science degree there, and I loved chemistry actually. And then I went and did all my studies in chemistry. I did a PhD in chemistry actually, and was ready to go to Heidelberg to do a postdoc position over there. I got a kind of an email or got contacted by this person named John Aitken. Didn't really know much about him at the time. He invited me for a chat, and he had a job opening up. And then I found out that he is a very big name in male reproduction from England, that moved to Newcastle and set up a group, and he's still with us. He's retired, but he's still working, and offered me a job. So I couldn't knock it back in my hometown. And he was looking for a chemist that could help out with sperm cell biology. And so here I am.
Here we are. There you go. And I know is it your family that has a history in wineries?
Yeah, that's right.
Did that play a role in chemistry at all?
Yeah. So my cousin and I are a similar age. We both did a Bachelor of Science. He went to Sydney and did it at Macquarie Uni, while I did it in Newcastle. And yeah, we were both brought up in that kind of field. They bought the vineyard, but when we were young teenagers, and he spent a lot more time there, but I was spent every two weeks there, every second weekend.
Yeah.
And then he decided to go on and be a winemaker, which worked out fantastic, and he's absolutely killing it.
Yeah, awesome.
Yep.
So we're going to talk a bit about infertility today.
Yeah.
I know there's a lot of misconceptions kind of around the fertility subject. Just to start us off, how do we actually define infertility?
So I suppose one of the things that people may not know is that conceiving naturally actually takes some time. So every round, if you like, there's about a 25% chance of conceiving for the female to become pregnant, and that's very, very normal. So given those kind of odds, we usually say between 6 months to a year of trying to become pregnant. And if that doesn't happen, so if you're trying for 6 months and it's not happening, that's no reason to stress. But then beyond a year is when you can start getting some advice around that and seeing a GP and then a fertility specialist.
So I think, at least in my experience, there was a lot of misconceptions even just a few years ago that infertility was kind of mainly driving from the female side. I know there was a lot of stigma around that too.
Yeah.
More and more research is kind of coming out now. Is it moving to the 50-50 male-female kind of contributions?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Ed. So, the burden of infertility was historically always placed on the female. What we are now finding, which really makes complete sense to me, given there's two people that are required to do this, is that it is largely 50-50. And what that means is that the science for male infertility is well behind the female, because all the science was geared towards, I suppose, fixing female fertility. And now that we understand, again, it makes sense that half of the reason why a couple might be infertile is due to the male. Again, the science is a little bit lagging. So there's many unknowns around, sperm cell biology and other things, which is, I suppose, what we concentrate on as researchers.
The first thing that kind of comes to mind for me, a bit of a funny example, would be Robert De Niro. I know he had a kid, I think it was 79 years old or something.
Yeah.
How much is it that age plays a role? Because I know we talk about kind of high risk pregnancies for women.
Yeah.
and we're talking around the 35-year-old mark. I think the correct term for it is advanced maternal age.
Yeah, and sometimes called geriatric pregnancies.
Yeah, which for someone that's 35, I think would be a bit of a shock to hear.
Yep.
And then we hear about stories of, males having kids at 79. How much does age, and we'll dive into this more later, how much does age kind of play a role in sperm cell health and conception as a whole?
Yeah, really good question. So most people know that female reproductive potential drops off with age, and that's largely because they have a finite pool of eggs, which wane during the course of life. The male situation is completely different. We're continually generating new sperm cells all the time. So, roughly about 1,000 sperm per second a male is making. And that actually only slightly slows down as a man ages. And I think the oldest man I know of was like 93 or something like that, who's fathered a child. So it's certainly possible to father a child at an older age. But what we do know is as a male ages, then the quality of the sperm that they produce starts to become lower and lower. And we can get into a bit more what the consequences of that are. But yes, certainly a man can father a child at an older age, but there are potential risks involved with that.
Yeah, definitely. I think just to throw some stats at it, I did some research last night actually.
Yeah.
And I found the WHO reported that 1 in 6 people are now kind of globally facing infertility problems. And sperm counts as a whole from 1970s have dropped 50%.
Yeah.
What are the kind of bigger environmental society kind of factors do you think that's contributing to it?
An alarming thing is that the people that they're talking about are in the fertile window, so these are not necessarily the people of advanced age. So this is a whole other issue, is that you're looking at young, healthy men, if we're focusing on the males, that have, absolutely right, is a clear decline in the amount of sperm they're producing. There is ongoing evidence to say that the quality of the sperm they're producing is declining from, if you would 20 years ago, if you went and did a semen test, you're struggling to get pregnant with your partner, you'd go and get a test done. Usually what the andrologist, who's the person who does those kind of measurements, would be looking at something like 200 million cells per mil in the ejaculate. That has now been revised down to 20 million per mil. So 10 times lower than what it was. And that's just the fact that, normal fertile men produce on average about 20 million cells per mil. Whereas, that used to be a lot more. And that evidence is very clear.
Yeah. Is it the same for women? Are women having fertility issues just as much?
Yeah, it's interesting. Our thought is that certainly what we know is that female infertility is the largest driver of that is advancing age. That is very clear. The things that are driving male infertility, it's not as clear as that. It seems to be some interaction with the environment, the lifestyle that's affecting the man's fertility. Biologically, it does make some sense to us that, when a male produces a mature sperm, they're very, very different to any other cell in the body. They're the smallest human cell. The egg is the largest human cell, by the way. Sperm is the smallest human cell. Because of their uniqueness, they are much more vulnerable to external pressures than our normal cells might be, like our skin cells or whatever. So this means that they might be more vulnerable to novel environmental pressures. We can get into some of those if you like.
Yeah, definitely. We'll definitely be diving into that. Yeah. What is the optimal time biologically? Like I know people, societal expectations will kind of push you to have kids later, but biologically, where's the window?
Yeah. John, who I mentioned right at the start, who is still a very important mentor for me, he provided some information and has given numerous talks around this, and he has this wonderful slide where he looked at the traditional tribes, hunter-gatherers, and looked at their reproductive habits, and it was basically what we think reflects the optimal time for reproduction. And for those people, they start childbearing at around 19 years of age and then go on to bear usually 5 to 6 children over that time, which ends roughly around 32 years of age. So that kind of span between kind of 20 and 32 for a female. For a man, we get off more easily again. That again happens from a similar age, 19, but really we don't see any significant declines in fertility, generally speaking, until a man hits around the age of 45 to 50.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting because I think obviously society isn't geared to even support individuals for having children that young. But biologically, we're on such a different clock.
Yeah.
It's an interesting conversation for sure.
Yeah.
Outside of age, we're seeing these kind of clear links between fertility and factors like toxins, diet, obesity, stress, and even just a sedentary lifestyle.
Yeah.
Are those the main drivers? What are we looking at?
Yeah, I mean, again, it makes a lot of sense to me. Why would male fertility be declining only just now? We've been around for millions of years, right? So why are they declining over the last 50 years? So an obvious answer to that is that the novel factors that we are now exposed to, which we were never exposed to before, could be having an effect on our fertility. And that also makes sense to us biologically because we know sperm cells are very sensitive because of their uniqueness. They are sensitive. So these are the kind of things that we're exactly studying. We're trying to understand what factors, more likely, it's a combination of factors that are leading to the decline in sperm quality that we're seeing. So generally speaking, and I think we can talk about this later if you like, but generally speaking, what we do certainly know is the general health of a male will reflect their fertility potential and their ability to create the best possible quality sperm.
So when we talk about health, and we kind of mentioned this before we started the podcast, are we talking about cardiovascular health, diet health? What are we talking about? Is it overall health? How do you actually measure that?
Yeah. So again, it's a field that's being worked on very heavily at the moment within the reproductive sphere. But our knowledge so far is that general health seems to line with reproductive health for men. Again, something that does seem to make sense if you're in an environment where you can be healthy, where you can have a balanced diet, where you can be somewhat free of stress, then it would make sense to be fertile at those times. Whereas if you are unhealthy, you don't have access to the right foods, you're going through very stressful environments, perhaps that's not the right time to be bringing a new generation or a new individual into the plan, if you like. So yeah, we do find strong evidence to say that if a man suffers from things like diabetes, from cardiovascular health issues, then generally speaking, again, there's a very close link to a poorer fertility. We don't know the mechanisms about how that plays out. We do have some ideas for sure. We may talk about one of those later, but certainly there's a strong link.
We want to jump into oxidative stress. You've done a lot of work kind of linking that to damage in sperm cell DNA.
Yeah.
Can you give us an overview of what it is, just a broader kind of picture so we can dive into it more?
Yeah, so oxidative stress is essentially like a chemical imbalance in our cells. Our cells produce energy to get things done, and just happens to be a byproduct of that is some of these what we call reactive oxygen species. And that's completely normal. However, the oxidative stress occurs when those factors, those molecules start to take over and become too abundant. And that's when a cell would come into a state of oxidative stress. So some people may have heard that, there's plenty of research to suggest that cumulative stress, oxidative stress, is why we age. Along with that is the explosion of supplements that are antioxidants, right? That are meant to suppress that oxidative stress and keep us young. That's the science behind it. So, that's the thought behind it, not necessarily the science. So that's what oxidative stress is. It's essentially an imbalance that can damage the cells. And what we've found as a group, and what I've been really interested in and focused on in my career, is to understand that oxidative stress, how it is created in the male reproductive tract and in the sperm cell. So actually one of my first papers as a young researcher was to prove, using my chemistry nous, was to prove that these reactive oxygen species were actually produced in the sperm.
There you go.
So that was a lovely thing to be able to contribute to the field. And what we're now understanding, or at least our hypothesis, is that may be a central mechanism that is linking things like age, things like environmental toxicants, environmental factors, mental health, stress. Those things may be all working through oxidative stress in the male reproductive tract that then leads to the poorer quality of sperm that we're seeing. And importantly, that oxidative stress is quite impactful for the DNA, as you mentioned. So again, I say this all the time, no one has to be a reproductive biologist to understand that if you damage the DNA in either the sperm or the egg, then that's not a good thing.
Yeah. I think when you kind of look at the research you've done on oxidative stress, and you mentioned earlier, like, what's the difference between sperm counts and 50 years ago, and why we're having issues now. And I think that's definitely something that's probably more prominent in our world, is just stress and the way that we're kind of steering society towards more of a sedentary, more efficient is probably the word people would use, day-to-day lifestyle. I read, and I kind of wanted to ask you this myself, is excessive exercise a factor in oxidative stress?
It can be. I am certainly not an expert in exercise science, but I suppose anything outside, especially if it's chronic, is detrimental to male infertility. So if it's chronic exertion over, and what I'm talking about chronic is I'm talking about weeks and months. Again, males get out of the reproductive situation pretty easily, again, because the beauty of the male reproductive system is that if you go through a high period of stress and you may damage your sperm, the stem cells that repopulate those sperm are very robust, actually. And because we're generating new sperm all the time, again, I mentioned 1,000 a second, then if you overcome that stress, you can settle down, you can become healthy, you remove yourself from whatever exposures that might be damaging, regain some better mental health, then theoretically those sperm cells should reflect that, and over the course of 2 months or so, should come back to normal. And we do see this happening all the time.
So when we talk about sperm cell damage, we can have damage to the system that's permanent and not permanent. How do we differentiate that? Is it like a physical injury that would cause permanent damage, or is it like these external factors, oxidative stress?
That's a really good question, Ed. So certainly, if a male presents to be infertile and produces low number of sperm, usually the reasons for that, there are some rare reasons that are unknown, but usually the reasons are very straightforward, such as blockages in the male reproductive tract, right? Now, I mean, that's not great news for people, but it's actually something you can do something about. You can remove those blockages. When you don't know why someone's not producing sperm, then that becomes much more difficult to address. So those kind of more permanent issues, generally speaking, some of those are easier to fix. There are some rare situations where they're not. There can be genetic issues that are typically reasonably rare, where that's more problematic to fix. But certainly, if it's most of the problems can be transient, and that's why we promote good male health, because even if a situation where cigarette smoking is a massive one, that's been so robustly proven that a man engaging in cigarette smoking absolutely ruins their sperm. But if you stop smoking and you remove yourself from that environment and you look to be healthy, then it rebounds amazingly. The cycle is around 2 months to generate a new set of sperm cells, and that in fact happens. And that's why we promote good health, because of that reason.
And so taking I'm thinking back to year 6 getting kicked in the nuts from a soccer ball or something.
Yeah.
can we rebound from something like that?
Yeah.
What are we talking about?
Yeah. So those those kind of physical injuries, besides being incredibly painful, yeah, they do resolve usually pretty well, like most tissues in our body. One of the things that might align to that is we collect samples as part of our research quite often, and what we'll notice as we move into the flu season is a very significant decline in the number and the quality of some samples. And then later we find out that individual's, had a cold or had the flu. And that really impacts the quality of the semen sample they provide. But then in 2 weeks later, when they provide another sample, absolutely fine.
And so is that oxidative stress that we're talking about there? Is that something else?
So, yeah, I think, again, we don't 100% know if oxidative stress is a main driver, but what we do know is that, inflammation because of those infections will affect the production of sperm and the quality of that production as well.
Just another random question for you.
Yeah.
I do a fair bit of kind of hot cold therapy, saunas and ice baths and stuff.
Yep.
Every time I get in the ice bath, I'm always thinking, God, this cannot be good. Is there an impact with that? I know getting too hot can kind of be bad.
Yeah.
What about too cold?
I think the same rules apply. Like, I think anything that's outside the norms that is extended and chronic is probably not going to be good. You're right that it's very clear that overheating the testes is not good for sperm quality and sperm production. The whole reason that the anatomy exists is so that they are at around 35 degrees, around 2 degrees roughly cooler. And the reason for that is that the processes that underpin sperm production and their maturation within the testicles and a tissue called the epididymis, which surrounds it, requires that temperature. So if you go up and above that temperature, then the biology is not used to it and they reflect negatively. Cold temperature is a little less of a problem because the body will buffer. That's in some regards. We don't necessarily see a detrimental impact on sperm cells themselves until they reach around 15 degrees, which is never going to happen inside the scrotum, even in an ice bath, unless you're there for days.
Yeah.
So so that would be my take on it. Certainly, again, reiterating that anything outside the norm for extended periods of time are probably not going to be the best.
I know there was like a podcast that went around a while ago that would talk about how there's a correlation between male athletes and having daughters. And I think they linked it towards increased exposure to heat.
Yep.
And it was something to do with having more daughters than boys. Is that?
And jet pilots too. Apparently.
There you go.
There's some. So I will say that I don't believe there's any good scientific data that proves that, but certainly anecdotally it seems to be quite popular. We don't know what that mechanism might be. Interestingly, with other animal species, there's technologies where you can actually select the X-bearing or the Y-bearing sperm, then becomes either the female or the male, and you can select them and you can use them to create a male or a female offspring in those animals. However, that technology doesn't seem to work for humans. So there's no real good way of selecting a male or female sperm. So it's difficult to understand what might be driving a selection there. Again, the science behind it is probably quite controversial.
Yeah, we'll jump into the biomarker field a bit later.
Yep.
Drinking. So we know that's, if you don't know this, you should probably go and check it out. Drinking during pregnancy is extremely harmful.
Yep.
What about for men when you're trying to conceive?
Yep. Yeah. So interesting here. Like, I might go on a bit of a story and you might bring me back if I get too far. But we were talking about oxidative stress as being a key central mechanism that damages sperm production and sperm quality, and therefore antioxidants perhaps combating that. So interestingly, there are a lot of antioxidants in things like wine, even beer. So if we look beyond the alcohol, some might argue that having moderate drinking habits, not moderate, but in moderation, might have some benefits. And you might, you see this in the media sprinkled through every now and then. Drinking
red wine is good,
which is the same thing. The antioxidants, drinking red wine might have a benefit to you. So keep that in mind, I suppose. But again, it's to do with moderation. So for a woman that is, or a female that's become pregnant, then and really you advise them while they're trying to become pregnant, they should not be drinking alcohol at all. That very first couple of weeks of fetal development is absolutely crucial and very sensitive to alcohol. And that's why people get that advice. For the man, or the male, it's the same advice where, if you're looking to conceive with your partner, then you should be maintaining your best health as possible. I personally think that a drink here and there is not going to be bad. If you are having problems conceiving, then I would cut it out completely. And that would be, some advice from the GP or the fertility specialist as well. So yeah, I mean, you don't want to be binge drinking while you're trying to conceive.
What about testosterone? What's the relationship between high testosterone and sperm count, lower testosterone, sperm counts, things like that?
Yeah. So there are pathologies where the androgen production, so the male hormones such as testosterone, as you've just described, is dysregulated. So they're not made or circulated in the right levels, and that has drastic impacts on fertility. The main area of production of testosterone is within the testis, within a type of cell within the testis, and that directly informs the change from your sperm stem cell into the more mature stem cell. The mature sperm cell, and the numbers of those as well. So any disruption to that balance will affect the production of sperm.
Is it disruption to the balance that's considered normal for the individual, or is it considered normal for a standard level of testosterone?
Yeah, there's usually a standard level. That level of testosterone will start to wane with male age. But as I said, that's reflective of the ages that I provided before. So around that age, kind of 40, it starts to decline. 45 to 50 is where it starts to markedly decline. But that doesn't stop sperm production wholesale, but it's certainly that testosterone starts to decline. So yeah, so certainly, if there's a problem with sperm production for a male in their fertile window, then looking at hormones is a very important part. And there may be a pathology where they're not producing enough testosterone, for example. And that's another underlying condition.
Yeah.
And that can be sometimes can be fixed as well with supplements.
I don't know if this is a misconception or not, but in the bodybuilding, gym lifting world, it's a common thing to say you'll take testosterone and you get small nuts.
Yeah.
Or if you're taking testosterone, you won't be able to have kids or something like that.
Yep.
Is there some truth behind that?
Absolutely. Again, the balance, there's a concentration window which has been very finely tuned over the course of our evolution that maintains, prime reproductive potential. If you go outside those windows, then biology doesn't cope with that. And that cuts across many different types of scenarios, not just reproductive biology, but yeah, certainly too much testosterone will affect the production of your sperm.
And would you see it bounce back if you were to stop taking it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool. Another kind of common, I don't know if it's a misconception now, you'll be able to tell us this, is phone use, Wi-Fi, 4G. You often get labeled a conspiracy theorist if you're shouting that there's dangers to using it. You've done actual research on mobile phone use and sperm health.
Yeah.
What did you find?
Yeah, so this has been a really interesting kind of part of my research career. We had a grant finished up, I think, in about 2019 from the NHMRC, which was to look at this idea. And yeah, really interesting project. What we found was that, I suppose myself being more fundamental scientist coming from a chemistry background, but also reflecting in our laboratory at Newcastle University, is we're really interested in fundamental discovery science. And we strongly believe that that understanding will lead to better healthcare in the reproduction space. And that's generally the way we do things. So I tackled that question from that situation. So the first thing I wanted to do is really smash the sperm. I got purified the sperm, so they're just in a petri dish, chucked them in what we call a waveguide, which simulates things like Wi-Fi, mobile phone signals, and really hammered them. So basically like chucking them in the microwave. we made sure that there was no heating effects,
Yeah.
right, when we did that. So we controlled for that. And what we found is very clear, and we repeat it over and over again. I've had a number of students and PhD students looking at this, and there is a dramatic effect. The loss in motility is incredibly clear. So after these exposures to things like 3G network signals, for, again, quite high level, we're talking about not the levels that you would see in the environment necessarily, there are clear effects. So there is something going on there. So then we've taken that further and looked to see in a more realistic way if there may be effects. And what we've seen is that, yes, there is. While we still don't know what those kind of signals and Wi-Fi means for our reproductive health, we certainly do know that there is a biological effect, and we're honing in actually on the very granular detail of how those effects come to pass. And yeah, very excited about, hopefully getting some more funding to look at that further. The take-home message is that we know that there is an effect. Absolutely, a lot of people, perhaps in the telecommunication field will say that that's impossible, that there's no effect. But hand on heart, I can see that quite clearly, again, over many years of replication. If there is an effect, we may not see it for, a couple of generations. So obviously, if the effect was great, none of us would be fertile anymore, right? We'd all be dropping dead from brain cancer and things like that. But that's not happening. So if there is an effect, it's going to be much more subtle, which we might not see for a couple of generations. So again, our message is that if there is an effect, it would be better to know sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
What we're hoping is that there isn't, and it's a good news story. But I think you would agree with me, and I think the public would agree with me. It would be good to know.
Yeah, especially the preventative side of things. I think that was a lot of people's concerns, not to dive into this kind of conspiracy so much.
Yeah.
But with the COVID vaccines, a lot of people were like, we don't know what the long-term effects of these are. And normally there's research that's been done years on years and on end for vaccines. And I think that was a lot of people's fear, was we don't want to start ingesting things that we don't know the long-term effects of. Like maybe it won't, harm us in the immediate moment, but what's it going to look like down the future? And I think that's super important. Is the answer we walk around without our phones in our pockets? Is it designated time away from all these signals and things?
I think, that, we look at certain environmental factors on their own. So we've looked at things like Wi-Fi and phone signals. We've looked at, now banned flame retardants. We've looked at heat stress. But we firmly think that it's probably a combination of all those things that might be impacting a male's fertility. So what I say, when people ask me about mobile phone devices and the use of laptops, is the same I would say, around smoking and around general health. Is if you're trying to conceive, then maybe it's better to keep the phone away from your front pocket. I always make the joke that I've had my two beautiful children, so I've got my phone permanently stuck to my, to my thigh. But yeah, I mean, that's the advice, is that we don't know, but there's some biology to suggest that with other things are leading to a lower fertility. So anything that you can do to maximize your fertility in that window, why not do it?
Yeah, and it's kind of operating on the rule of our fertility system will bounce back, even if there is some small level of harm going on there.
Again, males are somewhat lucky in that regard again, because that's exactly true. If we've had some sort of insult, like if we've gone through a very bad flu and a fever has affected us, our testes will warm up and the sperm production will be heavily impacted by that. Wait a month or two, and it's completely back to normal. And it's the same with any other kind of external stress. Most of those that don't affect the stem cells, where our sperm come from, the fertility will bounce back. Unlike in the female.
And so, kind of moving further down the line here, parental age and future child health. We know that oxidative stress plays a role. We know that radiation, things like that, can play a role. Heat. We kind of mentioned the example before of Robert De Niro.
Yeah.
How does age directly affect sperm?
Yeah. So as a man ages, the ability to, I suppose, produce sperm cells with the fidelity that a younger man or male would is less. Okay. So you're still able to produce sperm, no problem with that. But there's incredibly intricate mechanisms involved in creating that sperm. I can't remember the exact time frames, but I think for a mouse, it takes something like 2 months to make a sperm cell. However, to make a new mouse, it takes a couple of weeks. So it takes more time and energy to make a sperm cell than it does to make a whole new individual, right?
There you go. On that point, before we keep going,
Yeah.
sorry, we can digress and come back.
Yep.
We're looking like, what's the world look like in 20, 30 years? We're creating AI technologies. There's people, I think it was in Norway, maybe Canada, that are bringing back the dire wolf. Where's the science taking us on this? Obviously, IVF and things like that is somewhat external. What's the extent that we can create?
Cool. That's that's a very interesting question. I think certainly as science progresses, it will be done. Even the knowledge that we've gained around genetics, epigenetics, which means, certain heritable traits that are not specifically in our DNA, other factors, the pathways that govern development. So, how a fetus goes, how a sperm and an egg gives rise to an embryo and then a fetus. I think our improvements, the advances in our knowledge has been insane over the last 20 years that I've been involved. So, that's only going to continue. And so with full understanding, I think you will be able to do that.
Yeah, I think that was an interesting point I wanted to talk about today with the direwolf example, because we've got, this species that we're supposedly bringing back. I think the study was using wolf-like species that have kind of been passed through the tree for thousands of years to kind of help that process. But the interesting question for me is, we've got these prehistoric animals that are trained to hunt and do all their automatic behaviors, and we're putting them in a world that's completely different now. It's probably an impossible question to answer, but how would you expect that to interact if you were to pull a completely different animal from thousands of years ago and put them into today's society and then replicate from there? What do you think would happen?
So, I mean, I think there's a fair bit of work going on around de-extinction. One of the questions is, like, should we be doing this? Is it appropriate to be doing this? Because, what are the impacts for this animal that was around, as you've said, Ed, in a very, very different environment? What, is that ethical to now bring them back into this environment? What potential impacts would that have for the animal, but also the ecology that it surrounds it? So that's a question that people are certainly asking. In terms of the animal, I have a colleague in Melbourne who's working on this, who's funded by Colossal, which is the firm that's trying to bring back ultimately the woolly mammoth. He's looking at using the Tasmanian tiger. So bringing back the Tasmanian tiger, and the technology they're developing there is insane, absolutely insane, because they have the support to be able to do it, and they're making progress. One of the things that we know is that we don't have that animal to give birth to that animal, right? So there's a multitude of different biological and scientific problems that need to be overcome before that happens, but I think it will. Now, what that means for the animal's ability to reproduce, I think, will be a very important topic. And I would doubt that, the first iteration, if I can say it that way, of bringing back or de-extincting these animals, I doubt that they would probably be fertile. But we never know.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic.
Yeah.
I think the ethics behind it is, it's an interesting conversation to have as well. Are we using these technologies for the purpose of saving endangered species, or are we bringing them back just for the sake of creating a Jurassic Park?
The pursuit is very worthwhile at the moment, because what it's doing is really accelerating technology, which is fantastic. So it doesn't necessarily need to be used for de-extinction, but it could open up a whole new
avenues.
Medical, for example, a whole bunch of other avenues. So that technology, that investment to get that technology is well worth it.
So kind of coming back to before we digress. We're talking about parental age, future child health. Is there correlations between older parental age and autism?
So for the female, fertility drops off quite precipitously, around that age of 32 to 35. And then, you can go from around having a 25% chance of being pregnant when you're 32 to about a 2% chance when you're 42, right? So there's a huge decline. Now, for the male, that doesn't necessarily happen as sharp as that, nowhere near as sharp. But what does happen is that quality of sperm production, particularly the maintenance of the paternal genome within the sperm, which ultimately is what sperm are, right? They're really, just a package with a little outboard twiggly, kind of tail motor to get that paternal genome to the egg. So the fidelity in preserving that paternal genome intact is lessened as you age. So what that means is there's a potential to bring in mutations or DNA damage into the embryo. Sometimes that's not detrimental. Sometimes it's not detrimental to the next individual, but it can well be with cumulative, I suppose, pro-mutations is what we say, because there's not necessarily a mutation in the sperm itself. It becomes a mutation once fertilization takes hold. But after subsequent generations, if we keep using sperm that contain DNA damage, then it's very likely that we're going to get bad mutations in the embryo. And we know that this can lead to miscarriages, where the embryo forms, but there's too much damage that's come from the father that leads to miscarriages. That's in a more extreme situation, but then there's much more subtle situations where this DNA damage doesn't necessarily have an effect on the viability of the offspring. So the offspring can be born normal, but then we see these a very strong link with complex neurological conditions such as autism, which again makes sense because I think, the changes that we're likely to see in the sperm have to be subtle. If they're overt, then the sperm probably won't fertilize the egg, or the embryo that it's supporting probably won't make it through to full term. So if it's a subtle effect, then a subtle thing like complex neurological conditions makes sense. And there's a very clear link to the prevalence of autism in the offspring with paternal age. So as a man becomes older, the likelihood that you're going to father a child with autism becomes increased.
And so is that a hypothesis for why we're getting massively increased autism rates now?
I don't know if it's something I could really comment on confidently. I certainly understand the biology behind how that mechanism would work. And we've got publications on that also link oxidative stress to that. However, I suppose I would have to be more well versed in, that common idea is it something that we're screening for or noticing a bit more than we used to? So it's difficult to say from my point of view, but what we definitely know, and I'm convinced of the science, is that as a man ages, the risk of having the things like a complex neurological condition in the child is elevated.
And that's due to the mutations that can happen.
That's due to the damage that's carried by the paternal genome in the sperm. Yep.
I want to kind of branch into this more ethical kind of discussion with you. Can you give us an overview of what, for those of us that are early in their 20s and haven't had the conversation of kids yet, what are biomarkers and what's the capabilities that we have? Can we flag for Alzheimer's? Can we flag for
I see.
cancer? Like where are we up to in that?
Yeah, and that's another controversial area, certainly ethically as well. And I find it kind of semi-linked to the idea of sex sorting sperm. Should we be able to select male or female? Yeah, I mean, the technology is certainly there. You can create an embryo, which is what IVF is. So in vitro fertilization, where you take an egg, you take sperm, you let them fertilize in culture, and then you look at and maintain the early embryo as a result of that fertilization. And so from that one cell, so that fertilized egg, you undergo mitosis, cell division, and you
I
get
just learned that from Geoff.
Yes,
for anyone listening.
excellent. And then there's a rapid proliferation of cells, right? So you get 2 cells, then 4, then 16, and it just expands. So what you can do in the lab is you can take a sort of rip out gently 1 or 2 of those cells from the embryo. The embryo is not necessarily going to miss those cells, and you can start looking at the genome of that individual. And the technology is certainly there. You can certainly pick up genetic based diseases. You can pick up things like trisomy 21, which is an extra copy of the 21st chromosomes, or Down syndrome, you can pick up other genetic abnormalities as well. So if you have those genes, then you either will or very likely get some of those diseases. And some of those could be things like predisposition to cancer, so having these kind of guardians of our genome which prevent cancer from taking hold. If something's wrong with the gene that encodes for that guardian, then that individual can be predisposed to getting cancer later in life.
IVF, assisted reproductive technologies, is IVF the best option?
Great question. Yeah, I think professionally and personally believe that it is. So there's a number of different options available. The most common should be IVF. It certainly was the most common. However, there was a new innovation a couple of decades ago called ICSI, so intracytoplasmic sperm injection. And this is a situation where you would go from in vitro fertilization. So if I can set the scene, you take a sperm sample, you get an egg, you put them in a culture dish, you let them do their things, sperm swim around, find the egg, fertilize, and you get the embryo, you culture the embryo, then you implant the embryo. That's IVF. Now, many men that undergo that procedure, their sperm are present, but they might not be motile. They may be motile, but they can't recognize the egg. And if you can't recognize the egg, you can't participate in fertilization. So the way to get around that was a technique to actually draw up a single sperm cell in the capillary and then physically inject it into the egg. And that act will induce fertilization. And then you get the same kind of embryo development. You take that embryo, implant it. Now, the problem with that is that is entirely artificial. So the embryologist who's picking that sperm will look at the sperm and say, that looks like a pretty good shape. It seems to be motile. It seems healthy. But unfortunately, based on those principles, we can't be certain that there's no DNA damage in that sperm. So what we may inadvertently be doing is picking sperm that harbor DNA damage and creating embryos from those sperm. If you go back to IVF, then this is something that we're working on quite extensively at the moment. There's strong evidence to suggest that the mechanism or the process the sperm needs to go through to actually fuse with the egg and reach the egg and fuse with the egg will almost guarantee that sperm's DNA is of the best quality.
Right.
So that's why we would suggest that IVF is a much better technology, not necessarily to become pregnant, but for the health of that offspring, IVF is much safer. So unfortunately, through the advent of ICSI, that is exploded in popularity, and in fact is now the most common way of conceiving.
There you go.
Is through ICSI. So what we try to do as scientists and reproductive biologists is campaign to the public and to the IVF clinics as well, who understand this as well, is to revert back to IVF, which we think is much safer for the offspring's health. Yeah.
And so you mentioned before about sperm motility, and we spoke about the effects of phone radiation on that. Does it directly just affect the movement, but you said its ability to recognize an egg? How is that related? Because obviously just movement and recognition is two different things.
Completely two different things.
Yeah.
So the sperm has got an arduous job, right? It leaves the testis, it goes through this tissue, which I mentioned before, the epididymis, which is within the scrotum, and then it goes through the vas deferens, via ejaculation into the female reproductive tract. The process of maturation for that sperm is continuous the whole way through that process. And it only gains the ability to gain the proper motility and the ability to find the egg and engage with the egg after it's gone through that whole process. So even into the female reproductive tract. So what IVF does is try to replicate the female reproductive tract in vitro, right? So we get that maturation happening. So those processes are incredibly complex, and we think that is for good reason, because if anything goes wrong with that, then abort mission, right?
It won't work.
Yeah. And what we think is happening there is that if a cell a sperm cell's been exposed to some sort of damaging agent, it's likely that it could have damaged the DNA. which means that it disrupts the process, the maturation process, for it allows it to bind to the egg. So it's basically an emergency stop, if you like.
Yeah, there you go. Kind of coming back to the biomarkers IVF talk, what are the kind of ethical considerations people should be aware of when going to check for biomarkers and things like that?
Yeah, it's a really tough one. My opinion is that, I mean, the technology is there, but I think if there are major risks, so if there are markers that are found which can lead to a major risk of disease and the well-being of the offspring, sometimes less common could be complications in pregnancy as well, and putting the female or the mother in danger. I think it's worthwhile having that conversation. Again, I mean, I don't have a strong opinion that it should be banned or that it should be not banned. But I think what I can say is the technology is there, and it's an important conversation for us to be having about that utility of it. Is that going to be helping society in the future? Perhaps it will, but it's a larger discussion, I think.
There was a study that was done on pregnant women's anxiety levels after getting ultrasounds,
Right.
and it decreased because it was like obviously reassuring to them that
Yeah.
the baby was okay.
Yeah.
What's the kind of link? Because if we're testing for biomarkers, obviously there's probably going to be some of that effect as well. You're going to be more reassured. But what if they flag an issue? That's obviously a dilemma there. Do you want to inform someone if there is? Because is that going to stress them and cause more damage, or?
Yeah, fantastic question, Ed. I think I think you're absolutely right. I think the stress that would create is certainly not going to be good for the pregnancy situation, and that's another part of the discussion. What's the benefit versus the adverse outcomes? Is it worth doing? And look, I think there's a discussion that's really required there.
Yeah, it's individual.
But you're right. You're right. Even going through the process of IVF is incredibly stressful, right? Incredibly stressful. No one, as you're kind of in high school and in your early 20s, you tend to think about, well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to afford a house, or am I going to be able to do a Europe trip this year? You don't know. But one thing that you don't really think about is your ability. Am I going to be able to have kids? You just assume that you are going to. So going through that whole problem is a shock. It's a huge mental load. So there's inherently problems with that as well. I just wanted to flag that.
Yeah. I think it's a good point to make. I think especially for people who are in school, or maybe you're just finishing your degree at uni or something. It's like you have this tunnel vision to finish your education, and then I'll be an adult, and then I'll do this, and then I'll do that.
Yeah.
And you don't really think much further on that. But then what people aren't realizing is not only are we living longer, but also your life doesn't end when you're 30. You've still got, for most people, another 50 years.
Yeah.
What are you going to do then? Well, you probably want to have a family.
Yeah.
Most people, not everyone.
Yeah.
And so, I think it makes sense that it's so stressful when you get to this point where you go, cool, I've missed or I'm coming to the end of my kind of biological window, and I want to have kids. Now's the chance, and now I'm having issues.
Yeah.
It would be stressful.
Super stressful. And I think that's why, another discussion is very worthwhile into how do we support people to start families when they're biologically supposed to, I suppose. Again, one of the quotes from my mentor, John, is that we can't change biology, but we can change society.
Yeah, 100%. That's a good point. So you mentioned, how do we support people having children in their biological window?
Yeah.
What are some of the societal changes we could have to support that?
Yeah, again, I think the discussion around that will be really important. But, stemming from what I know, which is reproductive biology, again, we are certainly looking at ways of extending reproductive lifespan, and where we have had a bit of look at that, certainly in the female side of things. But I think the easier fix for now, and the quicker fix for now, is to not worry about changing our biology, but change and support people to have children younger. One of the things that, again, we're seeing linked to age is not only the incidence of infertility, but consequences for the offspring, right? That's the concerning thing. So not just the ability to be able to have children, but if you can have children, what does that mean for the health trajectory of our whole population, generations and generations into the future? So, this could be something that's compiling and compiling. So, we should be looking at providing, changing that ability, or giving the choice to people to not pick a career and education and family, but to do both. And provide, as a society, we should be able to provide the means for people to do that if we want to look into the future and maintain a healthy
Population.
generations. Yeah.
Yeah, especially when people are having kids later and later.
Yeah.
And the research supports that as well, where we're pushing that back further and further.
Yeah.
Do you think it's because people are choosing careers over families?
Oh, absolutely. I think, society is geared, you said it yourself, Ed, society is geared that, you do your education, to get a job. And then once you've got a job, you want to build a career for stability. Hopefully for this generation, it's incredibly difficult to own your own home and those kind of things. But that's why you work is for most people that want to have a family, is to set themselves up to be able to do so. So yeah, I agree that's taking longer and longer and longer to be able to set yourself up to do that, which is not, it is going against our biology. Yeah.
And so should we only take care of our fertility health, which is general health, as we kind of uncovered before, when we're trying to conceive, or is it something that we should be actively keeping in mind for our lifespan?
Yeah. I think education around the importance of health and how that's linked to reproduction is key. And I think, we try to engage with students around that year 9 and year 10 as they're learning about, the sex education and what happens during puberty and reproduction and those kind of things. And I think getting that message out around reproductive health and getting younger people thinking about that is always going to be helpful, and that's a major outcome that we want to try and push as a research unit as well. But I think the advice at the moment is that if we focus on the male, if you're a male and you're undergoing fertility issues, then it's not necessarily too late to have a look at your health status and try to make some changes to improve your health.
Yeah.
So again, coming back to the biology where, again, males are lucky, we can regenerate new sperm cells. So in a healthy environment, we should generate more healthy cells.
If you could give people listening 3 bits of advice, what would you give them?
So if you're looking to conceive, I think that just be aware of things that you're putting into your body. So what we want to do is certainly remove things like cigarette smoke, illicit drugs, alcohol. I'm a little bit on the fence. You certainly do not want to be binge drinking while you're trying to conceive. In general health, balanced diet. I mean, it sounds all very boring and generic, but these are critically important steps that you can make to maximize your fertility. And for anyone listening there, I'm hoping that this doesn't apply to you. But if it does, if you're doing everything you can to maximize your fertility, hopefully you won't have any problems, and you'll never know, which is, I think, the best case scenario.
Yeah. Is it the same advice for women?
Yeah. So for women, it's slightly different. I think that I think the message is maybe perhaps much more commonly understood in our society, that the health of the woman while they're trying to conceive and while they're carrying a child is key, right? Most people will inherently know that. So, and that is true. But I think, the message is that also applies to the man. That's something that society doesn't seem to kind of grasp yet, but that's the message that we're trying to get out.
Where can people find more of your work?
Yeah, so you can always go to the university webpage, the University of Newcastle webpage, and we have a profile there. We're also affiliated with Hunter Medical Research Institute, HMRI, and we're also looking at getting a bunch of kind of public events going to kind of get this educational information out to people around reproductive health. I'd also like to kind of mention that uh, the group based at Newcastle is quite world renowned. Something that certainly attracted me to the group, even though I was a local. The expertise that we have in, particularly in sperm cell biology, is again respected all over the world, and I've had the privilege of traveling all over the world and seeing this firsthand, which is quite humbling actually. So yeah, I think if we can get that message out to say that we have a world-class set of expertise here in our region, and for anyone that's listening that might even be professionals in the field, please, we do have a bunch of connections, but yeah, please, try and contact us and
Reach out.
yeah, reach out.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Ed.
Cheers.
Are you natural at this or what?
This is my second episode.
I think you're very good. No, I think you're very